My name is Nasir Yassin. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences and at the same time the Director of Research at the Fares Institute here. We are glad to have our colleague, Dr. Dina Kiwan. Dina is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies here at AUB. And she's been educated at the universities of Oxford, Harvard, London, and in her previous position, she was a senior lecturer in citizenship studies at Birkbeck College and University of London. And at the same time, she was the co-director of the International Center for Education for Democratic Citizenship. I know Dina since London, but she didn't recall me, so I was still a student at that time. Her research program, and I know about this program, focuses on citizenship, inclusion, and education, which is an interdisciplinary program and international in its scope. She works on issues including citizenship education, gender, human rights, refugees, immigration, and naturalization. What Dina will be talking about today is a very interesting idea of implementing a holistic, lifelong learning policy. This is part of an idea that we're entertaining with Dina. We're trying to produce a policy paper and a policy brief about this issue. And it falls under this title of the talk on the implications of widening access to higher education in the Arab world. So I'll give the floor to Dina. This is a very interesting idea that we want to entertain and explore, and whether a holistic lifelong learning policy can be applied in Lebanon and the region. Dina will have 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. The event is recorded, and it will be put on YouTube, and I think it will be tweeted live, and all the social media, fanfare, and other stuff. So welcome, Dina, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for coming, and thank you to IFI. Thank you to IFI for inviting me to open this discussion. Yeah. Hello? Yeah? Okay. Thank you to IFI for inviting me to open this discussion on the issue of widening access to higher education in the Arab world. I'd just like to give a disclaimer, first of all, that I'm not any kind of expert or specialist in higher education, but I come to this with an interest, given my interest in citizenship, inclusion, and education more broadly. So that I hope that this is really just a way to kind of open up a topic for discussion, to start thinking about it. And so, forgive me if there are experts in higher education in the audience. It's just really meant to open debate around ideas. So just in terms of how I want to structure my comments today, first of all, I'm just going to say a few words to set the scene, to think about what's happening in higher education in general, what are the trends, looking at how higher education in the Arab world has expanded recently, what future trends are predicted to be in the Arab world. But then, before focusing in on the issue of access and what that means, I'd just like to step back and consider a few conceptual issues or debates. So I'm just picking up on a few things. So one of the things that I'd like to open up and think about is quite often education is framed in terms of rights to education. Is there such a thing as a universal right to higher education? And then thinking about what does wider participation mean, looking at it in relation to discourses of neoliberalism, thinking about increasing participation versus widening participation, and then linking that to what's actually meant by lifelong learning. I mean, these all become buzzwords, especially in policy circles: widening participation, access, lifelong learning. And then also the idea of, we're not necessarily thinking of a linear route that, you finish school, you're 18, you go on into university. So the notion of second chances into higher education for those who are what we call in the UK mature students, coming back into education at different points. And then I'll move into thinking about what does access mean, what does it look like in the Arab world, what are some of the key trends, and the debates around, or how things are sometimes juxtaposed, access versus quality, equity, relevance, those sorts of buzzwords. And then just finishing up with summarising what are perhaps the key challenges that we're facing in this region, and some tentative recommendations. Okay, so setting the scene. So, I mean, really the last half century, the changes that we've seen in higher education really as significant as the changes in the 19th century in Germany when we witnessed the research university emerging. So now we're witnessing the logic of massification. So this is seen as something inevitable. It's a shift from post-industrial economies, the rise of service industries, knowledge economy. And so these are just some statistics. So in terms of access from 19% in 2000, these are global averages, to 26% in 2007. But of course, there's a huge range across different regions. So sub-Saharan Africa, the lowest, at around 5%, the Arab world around 25%, that's in 2007. And projected to reach 40% by 2030, according to UNESCO. Now, the United States was the first to achieve mass education, with 40% attending higher education in 1960. But all countries have shown this shift, this increase in percentage of access over time. And so it involves greater social mobility for more. There are issues in terms of funding higher education, diversified higher education systems, concerns around lowering of academic standards, the idea of ranking universities, competition, and also internationalization. Now, so at first with this mass increase, this massification, the focus was on coping with demand, developing university infrastructure, but now we're seeing all the issues of what are the implications for dealing with diversity and also inequality or inequity in access. Whilst we're seeing trends to greater inclusion, the most privileged have retained their advantages globally. This is most stark in terms of urban-rural differences, indigenous or minority groups, and in terms of socioeconomic status, this is one of the greatest predictors of exclusion, as cost is an enormous barrier to access. And this is the case even when tuition is free, because of hidden costs, whether of transport, living expenses, and also just the loss of income, and also psychologically the fear of debt. Now, on the top of many nations' policy agendas is a concern about quality assurance, the notion of consumers driving this and demands for certification, student mobility, and concerns about what are the outcomes of education. Another trend is, and a big area of work is around financing, the whole public-private debate. So, a shift from education being seen as a public good to a private good, in part instrumentally driven by funding shortages. We're seeing an increase in privatization, this is at 30% globally, and also a shift in terms of how the university itself is conceptualized. So from a traditional social role, service to society, to one of cost recovery and university industry links. We're also seeing, with the rise in technology, distance learning education. We're also more recently seeing massive open online courses, or MOOCs, sometimes framed in terms of increasing access. There's still not a lot of research evidence necessarily supporting that, but that's the rationale framing these kind of initiatives. So, for example, Indira Gandhi National Open University in India has 1.8 million students. And then in terms of projected trends, student numbers are expected to rise even further, and higher education systems to expand to accommodate this. More women are expected to enter into higher education, and a more diversified student population. older, part-time. And so central to national debates is going to be this issue of access for disadvantaged groups. Okay, now I'll say something about the expansion of higher education in the Arab world. So we've seen significant growth in post-World War I and World War II period. If you look in 1939, there were only 10 universities in the Arab world. By 1961, that had doubled to 20. 75, it was at 47. 2000, over 200. And then most recently, the count at 2011 is that there are 398 universities. And so also what there's been is there's been a diversification in the types of higher education provision, including distance education universities, as I've mentioned. For example, the Arab Open University being one of them. And the universities had a particular kind of place in terms of the history of the post-colonial period, a symbol of new national identity, national development, autonomy. For example, in Lebanon, Lebanon established the Lebanese State University in 1952. It's interesting that, this was at a time when there were only 3 government secondary schools. And that's not to say, of course, that massive missionary schools, foreign language schools, so on. But the university itself was seen as important, as a symbol. If we look at Egypt, Egypt established itself as a regional leader in national higher education. King Fuad first renamed Egyptian University, then later Cairo University in 1952. It was initially a private university, but this was nationalised in 1925. And then now if we look at the countries in the Gulf states, they're very concerned with the higher education sector. So this is a sector on the ascendant, and they're really aiming for, really taking a dominant role region-wide in this regard. Now, according to the World Bank, higher education in the Arab world faces 3 main challenges. So one, obviously, the expanding capacity. And then at the same time, there's always the concerns framed in terms of maintaining quality, relevance, whilst ensuring equity of access. And if we just look at the last decade, in terms of the rate of increase, it's very rapid, 20 to 30% rate of increase in access in the last decade. And then if we look at how that kind of breaks down in terms of different subjects, the majority are enrolled in humanities and social sciences. We see greater participation of women. This is especially in the GCC countries, now at 62%. It's partly explained that many young men go abroad to study, whereas women stay at home and go to the local universities. Enrollment is expected to grow to 40% by 2030. In terms of expenditure, a good percentage of GDP is spent relatively. It's in the region ranging between 1.6 to 2.6. But if it's to actually keep pace with enrollment, the World Bank predicts that it would need to rise to 3.3% as a percentage of GDP. However, when we look at the expenditure when it comes to research and development, that's really quite low. It's only at 0.39%. And just as a yardstick, the OECD average is 1.84%. What we're also seeing is that youth unemployment rates are very high, at 25%, higher than any other region. University graduates make up nearly 30% of the unemployed. We're seeing also massive privatization of universities in the region. Since 1993, 2/3 of the universities that have opened are private. And by 2008, over 1/3 of all higher education institutions in the region were private. And I mean, some of them have different models. So, some are very much run on a business model. Others have an older history, like that of AUB. So it's not necessary to put all in the same category. And then, obviously, in terms of World Bank and thinking about funding gaps and resources, they point to the Arab world diasporas with their estimate that it represents $42 billion, and this is a potential philanthropic source for higher education. So what are the main socio-political challenges that we're facing in the region? Well, UNDP, the Arab Development Report published in 2002, talks about the Arab world suffering from a serious knowledge deficit. And quote, this is due to an inward-looking nativism which has hindered Arab intellectual culture. And so this is attributed to different things. So there's reference to the translation movement, that there has been this movement for translation, but that it's stagnated, it's very haphazard, it's not clear what the rationale is for what gets translated, and that there's very low research funding, and that output for science and technology is only 1% of the global output. There's also reference to problems with governance, both in terms of at the level of the university, but also how this is often centralized. So it's also about governmental governance of the higher education sector. And it's typically characterized as being authoritarian, bureaucratic, highly centralized. And then there's also the issue of academic freedom. So I like this quote. In Arab universities, instead of academic freedom, there are different levels and types of academic oppression. And of course this varies within the region. So this is one challenge around the university, around knowledge production in the region and its governance. Another area that is a challenge is the privatization of higher education. So driven, profit-based, driven on business models. So again, there's concerns many of the higher education and many of the private universities are deemed to be of lower quality than the public universities. And then in terms of access, the focus of this talk, there's the issue of increasing inequalities, that those with higher income levels have greater access to higher education. So just to give an example, in Egypt, and Egypt has worked on the issue of widening participation and access. According to the World Bank in 2011, when you break down those of higher economic, in the higher economic status and lower economic status, these are the statistics, that 76% of those from the higher socioeconomic classes are gaining access to higher education compared to 9% of those from lower socioeconomic classes. So quite stark difference. Other challenges, well clearly there's great conflict in the region. This has been going on for some time. There's foreign occupation, civil strife, and we just look around Iraq, here Lebanon, West Bank, Gaza, Syria, and in general, this political instability, the university is a site where these battles get played out. So, in relation, if we look historically, Arab nationalism, communism, Islamism, secularism, and then most recently, the Arab Revolution since 2010. Political instabilities exacerbated by bleak economic prospects, and in particular what's pointed to is the mismatch between the education and what you get as outcome from education, and then that link into labour force participation. And there's research that illustrates links between poor economic prospects, education, and political protest. Then if we look at the demographics of the region, those are also challenges. 40% of the population is under age 18. We now have huge refugee populations. The region's facing the largest refugee crisis in recent history from Syria, with 78% being women and children. And if we look at Lebanon alone, with an estimated 1.5 million refugees, that's a third of the population in Lebanon. And if we look at it in terms of implications for education, 300,000 Syrian refugee children in Lebanon are not in education, and this is estimated to be that only 12%, this is under age 18, are estimated to be in school in Lebanon. So these are massive challenges. Also have the challenges of gender inequity. Although women's access has increased overall, this is not the full range of disciplines. So if we look, for example, to Saudi Arabia, women tend to be tracked into what are considered to be female professions of teaching and social work. And then what comes after that participation in higher education? The link into the labour force and politics. So women significantly are underrepresented. If we just look at Lebanon, Jordan and Iraq, for example, if we look at women's engagement in the labour force in Lebanon, it's 22.6%, Jordan 15.6%, Iraq 14.5%. Then if we look at representation in parliament, Lebanon it's 3.1%, Jordan 11.1%, Iraq 25.2%. This is according to UNDP's figures in 2013. Other challenges. So whilst there's been talk about the anticipated benefits of technology and distance learning initiatives, these have been critiqued that they're just kind of being cut and pasted from abroad, that they're not necessarily meeting local needs, not advancing local knowledge production. And then, for example, with MOOCs, the massive open online courses, although this is framed in terms of increased access for those traditionally excluded from higher education, it's not yet clear whether this can be delivered. So, for example, most recently, Queen Rania's Educational Foundation last year launched Idrak. It's the first Arab platform for MOOCs in the region. And I gave a course in the first batch of these MOOCs that were released last June. I gave a course on citizenship in the Arab world. And I just did a bit of basic statistics on who were the people enrolled in the course. So there were 6,000 people who registered and participated in the online course. But only 3% of that 6,000 were those who'd only completed higher school education or less. So basically, it's not targeting those that are not getting into higher education. It's those who are already there. You know, they might be undergraduates, master's students, PhD, even beyond, who are interested in further, complementing their study, rather than accessing a population that hasn't been accessed. So, I mean, that's just basis on my own course, but it's a question whether, this framing of increased access is actually going to be an outcome of these forms of technology. And then also another issue that's been pointed to is that there's not a lot of regional cooperation. There are a number of different bodies, but there isn't really a very concerted or effective effort in terms of regionally coordinating on these issues. Okay, so now I'd just like to kind of open up a few conceptual issues. So the first thing is that it's an important thing to think about, the idea of whether there's a universal right to education, and higher education in particular, as it obviously will have implications for positions on the conditions of access, the nature of provision, and the investment of resources. And so in these debates, there's a distinction between, is it a right to education or is it a privilege? It also leads us to think about conceptualizing what are the benefits of education. Are these intrinsic, in terms of at the level of the individual, personal development, and so on? Is it instrumental in terms of more macro level discourses of contributing to economic development? Or positional terms, so how you as an individual will fare relative to others within society. And then just to say that whether or not one decides that education is a right does not necessarily then therefore imply free access, so long as it's not an impediment to access. So these are some of the debates around, you know, the idea of a universal right to higher education. So Amartya Sen talks about rights primarily as an ethical demand, which obviously can lead to or be reflected in legislation. There's also the notion that this is perhaps kind of a fundamental right. It's a right upon which other rights are predicated in order to be able to exercise those rights. And then if we look at, you know, kind of policy discourses nationally, internationally, you know, there's an acceptance as universal, that the idea that, you know, there's universal access to primary and secondary education, greater debate about higher education. But in philosophical terms, McGowan has argued, well, that we wouldn't necessarily need to think about right to education as being restricted only to childhood or certain types of formal education. He talks about it in terms of a right having a lifelong application. We can also see references to higher education, for example, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It talks about, Article 26 talks about higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. And this is interesting, and this is what I want to explore a little bit more, is this notion of what is merit. So just from these kinds of debates, I'm just putting out 3 points. One, the notion of education is an intrinsic good, that it's not only instrumental. And so if we're thinking of it as an instrumental, an intrinsic good, exclusion from such opportunities would be conceived of as unjust. There's also the issue of distinguishing between accessibility and general availability. So arguing for a moral right to education is different from the issues of problems in implementation, whether there are enough resources or quality or so on. And then finally, how do we conceptualize merit? How do we measure it? How does it differ from capacity? So capacity indicates future potential rather than only past achievement. And so this has implications for thinking about the nature of access, especially in terms of thinking of students from disadvantaged backgrounds with poor schooling, with interrupted schooling, or those adults who are returning to education later in life. I'll now just say something about the terms widening access and participation. So there's a notion of an economic rationale created by global competition, technology, individual responsibility, personal development, social inclusion, citizenship. And these are all reflected in, you know, reports from the European Commission, Council of Europe, UNESCO, ILO, and so on. And they're often also linked to the notion of lifelong learning. And these can be both more instrumental kind of discourses, more intrinsic discourses. Then also notions of second chances back into education, the idea of the mature student. But as I've already mentioned, despite these international and national policies to widen participation, there are increasing social and economic inequalities. And also I've mentioned already that widening participation is associated with concerns around quality and lowering of standards. So we need to distinguish between increasing access and widening access. And what we've seen with global neoliberal discourses, that there's a shift from talking about things in terms of social justice to talking about economic development and discourses of quality, competitiveness, and the idea of individual choice. In the European context, there's been also a movement decentralizing, so that this responsibility is put at the level of the university. The university as a body works on how it interprets widening access and participation. So there's the idea of thinking about what do we mean by merit, and recognizing that there isn't a neutral definition of merit. It's located in terms of where we are in society. So we need to recognize how power and recognition operate within society and higher education. Now, in neoliberal discourses, the idea that these inequalities of access, whether by gender, class, race, they'll be eradicated by the market, by the exercise of choice, to participate in higher education. But the problem with this is that this doesn't address the different social positions individuals are located within. And so the different social and economic capital that they can acquire as badges of achievement that would be recognised as such and then legitimated. Just to quote from Duggan, it's the idea that social relations and ideology are saturated with race, with gender, with sex, with religion, with ethnicity and nationality. So that if we don't pay attention to how we think about merit, widening participation policies will just end up further differentiating and stratifying. So we need to think about redistribution and recognition. So this is going beyond the idea of the notion of merit in a static way. So for example, centralised school leaving exam performance as the key as the key to higher education access, that this is what's only recognised or legitimated. So we need to think about changing institutions and practices, not just about assimilating others in. So I'm just going to say a word or two about lifelong learning. That this has a long history. It's a very common term in many policy documents, but it's become very open and flexible in terms of its definition. And it means different things in different parts of the world. If we look at lifelong learning in the Arab world, it has a very narrow meaning. It tends to mainly be about adult literacy and adult education. And of course, this is not surprising given the context of 65 million non-literate Arab adults in the Arab region, with 2/3 being women. There are some school certificate equivalence programs as well. But there's also massive infrastructure problems with these programs. They're under-resourced, poorly managed, teachers that are not well trained or paid, and there are few evaluations of these programs. And now I'd just like to talk about the idea of second chances, because this is something that's not really very much kind of on the radar so much in this region, it would seem. From the European context, this is one of the main approaches, this idea of a second chance route. And there are three principles underpinning this approach. So it's the idea that failure is a temporary state, that one has the right to change, and also the notion of unlimited time. This is something I'm particularly interested in, as I see the idea of the second chance route as a way to challenge how we understand merit, and a shift to the notion of capacity. So it removes academic success as a determining factor for access to higher education. I won't talk about, I was going to talk a little bit about a study comparing differences in different systems in Europe, but we can come back to discussions of those examples if you're interested. So in terms of access to higher education, what does it look like? We have secondary school leaving exams. We can sometimes have entrance exams that are set by universities, or there are standardized aptitude tests. Sometimes there's a combination of these three. Sometimes there's no exam. There might be a school report, or it might be an application dossier. And then increasingly with the kind of second chance route, there's a consideration of evidence of work experience, alternative experience, and so on. And what about equity measures into higher education? So there's the notion of in reach, so that these are kind of props to help people assimilate. So summer schools being run. There's also the idea of access courses being given by universities. Outreach, so there might be links to schools, communities, and then the provision itself, so whether it's provided in terms of catering to part-time learners, distance learning, learning split with the workplace. There's the idea of giving financial aid, scholarships, And then there's also an approach of lowering of cut-off scores for different groups. If we look at the Arab world, we see that all Arab universities consider secondary education certificates or their equivalent as a basic standard for admission. And some faculties require a certain type of certificate or a certain score. The sciences tend to be more competitive or higher scores than humanities and social sciences. It tends to be very centralized in most Arab countries, for example, Jordan, Tunisia, Sudan, Syria, Iraq, Oman, Egypt. Private universities generally tend to have lower scores than public universities, for example, Egypt and Jordan. And some universities accept working students, but they tend to require some kind of certification. In other cases, working students aren't accepted, for example, in Oman. Some countries limit the validity of the certificate, some as limited as 1 year, some 2.5 years, some wider range, for example, Egypt, 5 to 10 years. This isn't the case for the Lebanese university. Some universities have aptitude tests, some have personal interview, and interestingly, some have age as a threshold for admission. I won't talk about Egypt as a case study. I'll just conclude now with what I see as the main challenges and some tentative recommendations. So I think the challenges facing us are issues relating to the Arab university as an institution. Some of the issues that I raised in relation to its governance, knowledge production, ethos, so on, infrastructure, resources. Also, I think a challenge in this part of the world is the narrow concept of lifelong learning, so that it's mainly just focused in terms of on literacy. Another challenge is the narrow conceptualization of merit and the narrow route into higher education. We're also operating in a context of political instability and harsh socioeconomic conditions. There's also weak regional coordination. And the approach tends to be quite macro rather than a more micro level. So there's little space or voice for the perspective of the learner or hearing what the perception of their needs may be. So in terms of recommendations, obviously it would be great if work can be done to strengthen the Arab University as an institution, greater expenditure on research and development, and improved and decentralized governance, diversifying routes of access into higher education, taking into account the debates about merit versus capacity and the fact that there's overrepresentation of middle and high income in higher education, and acknowledging the need to address second chances, which I think increasingly will be an issue in this part of the world with, given the context, civil war context where people have to drop out of school, millions displaced on the move, and that this is not a short-term thing. This is going to be with us for a while. Addressing the needs of the labour market and greater regional coordination. I was just looking at a study that was looking at quality assurance in this region, and looking at different countries. Very few countries actually had independent quality assurance bodies. Some had 5 had independent quality assurance bodies, 5 had government bodies, but the remaining 12 countries had no quality assurance mechanisms at all. Also the idea that public funding also through to the private university sector is an option, in particular in terms of addressing issues of equity of access. And this happens, if I'm not wrong, in Lebanon to some extent. And then finally, the idea of, in terms of resources, funding initiatives to tap into transnational philanthropy networks.
Okay, thank you very much, Dina. That was very interesting. Although almost all aspects to lifelong learning are narrow, as we say, except the political instability, which looks like very wide, but also it's an opportunity, perhaps, in such thinking into higher education. We'll take 3 questions and then we'll take another round. So let's start with Mr. Cortas.
Well, I listened very carefully to the speaker, and really I congratulate you for this very, very important subject. May I ask you at IFI, an institute of Fares Institute, Issam Fares Institute, to send us a copy of her speech, But I have some questions to be raised. The first one is related to the fact that in the Arab world, let us admit it, let us face the situation. Almost all the Arab countries, except Lebanon, partially, they have copied the Egyptian system of higher education and tried to apply this in the Arab countries. With all my respect to the higher education system in Egypt, where I lived for 5 years with FAO, I consider that it's not a good system for higher education. It is just memorizing things, except for those who have been abroad, to continue their education, either in Europe or in the United States. There, we have very good people there, we consider. Second, didn't say much about development and growth related to higher education. Higher education should be geared to more development, to more growth. I give you an example in agriculture education. In the whole Arab world, we don't have a very good course on farm management and production economics in agriculture. Although we have 26 universities here in Lebanon, but we don't have, maybe here at the AUB for a certain time they have been giving this course, then they have interrupted that. Then, what about foreign languages? Once I was at Aksat in Syria, and I asked them, do you have some of the American or the French or the British English publications? No, we have only this in Russian. Well, with all my respect to Russia, and they have done very good research in Russia. But the Russian language is not all over the world. It's not like the English language or the French language. Finally, what's the role of UNESCO and ISESCO for regional cooperation in education? This is their role. This is their mission to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. A lot of questions. We'll take 2 more. Yes, Dr. Hanafi.
Thank you, Dina, for the talk. It's. I would like to hear more if you have more concise recommendation between massification of higher education and the elitist model. The elitist model at EUB. I mean, how we can envisage a better model, and something struck me in the last election of EUB, that for the first time EUB students, they are not the microcosm of Lebanese society. The third of them, they vote for the secular club and not for 8 March or 14 March. So in fact, there is, it's amazing, EUB as a laboratoire of something new would happen in terms of Lebanese society orientation, etc. So how would you help the EUB model to be more inclusive and things like that? And finally, about Syria, I would disagree with you as I saw under success story Syria. I mean, I am one of the products and victims of Syrian system. I would say it's the public university there. It's really terrible. It's not only a question of language and access to publication, etc. But I mean, in social science, where we publish in Arabic, I mean, Syria scholarly community failed completely to show a model of a good education.
I share the concerns with these two questions regarding quality. The access is important, but also quality. You can have a lot of access without quality. I think we realize that at some point we discuss the quality assurance. I think there is something unnoticed failure that's unnoticed that doesn't only hit public universities, but also hits private universities, including AUB. And I think some of the statistics you mentioned, I think it's slide on the trend, it's a misleading figure. You're saying that there's an increase in higher education, especially in social sciences and humanities. That is true in public universities, because they get no good scores in their exams, and they have to select the least attractive position, which means mediocre students go to social science and humanities, which means that this field itself becomes more and more mediocre, looked down upon. If you come to AUB, you have a different vision. AUB has about 500 students in biology, has less than 10 in history. Now, I think this is a major failure in higher education. And people talk about increasing access, don't realize that this is a failure of both intrinsic value of higher education, because I think the intrinsic values of studying technical stuff is very low. The intrinsic values comes from studying social science and humanities, and the instrumental value for this region is very low, because our problems are not technical, they're social, historical, and therefore if the talents go into the technical schools and professional schools, they will not trickle down or up to solving our problems. And you go to private universities, you pay money, you go to technical schools or professional schools and sciences. You go to public universities, the bad students go to the social science and humanities. This is linked, even if you go to the, for example, Egypt, which is also an example of failure. Talented students go where? Go to medicine and engineering, go to the Muslim Brotherhood leadership. All of them are in medicine and engineering. Only one of them studies Islamic studies, only one of the Muslim Brotherhood, which means the low quality of understanding the real issues, governance, politics, justice. So I think that is, all these figures ignore that, in my opinion, one important location of failure of higher education. Because they also emphasize, they emphasize link between higher education and labor force. If you emphasize this, then you will focus on science, technology, engineering, and even vocation. This focus, this emphasis on the link between higher education and labor is a misguided focus. There is no link like that in England. People do study PPE in Oxford, politics, philosophy, and economics, and they go on to do business and to go to media. This emphasis has distorted the value of the importance of higher education and its relationship to the public life.
Thank you. So we have 3 questions and multiple questions each question. So I leave it to you to answer, and then perhaps the second round also would like to get some questions on the subject of which is the lifelong learning policy and approach. I mean, they're all related, but perhaps also hear your view on it.
No, just to start over here. Yeah, I mean, I didn't get to talk about Egypt. I did have a slide on Egypt, and you know, I agree with your comments that there are obviously real problems with that system. You mentioned also the idea of saying more about how higher education is a vehicle for the nation state to fulfill economic development goals, and certainly that's been the thrust of kind of the discipline of comparative education in the past. It's the idea that quite an instrumental vision that this is something that leads towards, and it's still present in policy discourses now. The Millennium Development Goals and so on have education as a means to reaching those goals. Some goals are educational. In terms of what's the role of ALESCO and ASCO, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's, you know, they're there as bodies. I'm not an expert on how effective or what they're actually doing, but from what I gather is that these bodies exist, but there's not a great deal of good regional cooperation going on. To move to Sari's question about massification versus the elitist model, what would one do, for example, so that AUB is more inclusive or widens access? I mean, I think it's also an issue of political will. And I think, I mean, this is not, I mean, you see this with all elitist universities. They're the ones that are kind of most concerned and resistant to notions of widening access if it challenges the way they want to conceptualize merit. But yes, there can be means to help others play the game, you know, whether it's through financial scholarship, as long as they perform, you know, no matter what their barriers to perform at the same level. But if they manage to perform, that, you know, there's financial aid, maybe there's some limited kind of preparatory schools, you know, summer schools, you know, for high school students from you know, disadvantaged backgrounds to access. But those tend to be kind of the approaches. So it does come down to political will and what you consider to be ways to gauge who is entitled to have access. And then this links to the idea who is entitled to have access. It comes down to whether you're conceiving of the right in intrinsic or instrumental terms, and if you're conceiving it more in intrinsic terms, then, you know, that logically would lead one to challenge it on the basis of competition for a set number of places and issues of quality. But then, you know, still one has these issues of quality to deal with, and, you know, I very much agree with your points, Bashar, and I didn't get into it about you know, mostly it's the mediocre students, the students with the low grades that go into the social sciences and humanities. But if one is thinking about widening access, it's also thinking about widening access where. It's not just a discourse of, you know, getting more students into doing science and technology and that link of, you know, I mean, I think it's important to think about the link between outcomes of education and the market. I think, you know, you give the example of PPE, and I think, yes, it works when you're in that kind of most elitist range. You can study whatever and then you still get a great job. But for the majority of people, they have to think in more practical terms that, you know, I need something and I need to get into the labour market. So I think we can't dismiss it completely, but I think we do need to think about the status of social science and humanities in this part of the world. And as you say, you know, thinking about education in intrinsic terms and valuing these disciplines is critically important given the challenges that we face. We need people who can think, you know, with social sciences, with humanities, the challenges that we're facing in this region. So I think that's something that I didn't mention in the talk, and I think isn't talked about so much in terms of conceptualizing widening of access, but it's also about access. It's not massification into social sciences and humanities, but it's also about a revaluing of social science and humanities, and what implications then that therefore has for access. And I certainly didn't mean to say this. I don't think I would say that Syria is a success story.
Thank you, Dina. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the shift, the linguistic shift in at universities. So in terms of languages of instruction, and how does it have, or have there been studies of the way it has effects on access? So just language, question of language and access, how those are related.
Thank you. I like the way you phrased the title of your speech. and I like the last part in your speech, the lifelong learning. I'm very much for that concept. And in Arabic, as you know, al-ilm min al-mahdi ila al-lahm. So nobody is against that, we are for that. I'm also, in fact, in favor of higher education, which is also part of your title, higher education. But when it comes to the concept of a university, which is a different concept from higher education, it's one institution that there is no other institution in society. You know, the university is a higher education institution, but it's different from the rest of the land. There, I think I'll have to stop and think again. And perhaps think of a very common concept of quality, leadership, production of knowledge, breaking new horizons, and exclusiveness, meaning not everybody. And I found myself very much, the more I think about it, the more I'm inclined to say that any institution needs, you know, any society needs a combination of institutions. And when it comes to the university, it's very, very careful. I think you need Mercedes, like a Volkswagen, you know, you need in any society, you need first-rate institutions. Otherwise, the whole system will collapse sooner or later. And I'm sorry to say that the situation, the numbers are increasing. Now we have 380 universities in the Arab countries. 40, 50 years ago, we had something like less than half. And those less than half are becoming very much depreciated, including AUB, let's be very frank.
Thank you very much. As a brief comment on Bashar's question and follow up to it, if I may relate very briefly a personal experience. At one time, I was involved in the International Baccalaureate Organization and was attending a conference of students who teach all over the world, all continents, teach a course called Theory of Knowledge. This is taught at the secondary school level. It's a required course. Anyone to get the diploma must pass this course. And it is intended essentially to help students think critically of how we acquire knowledge, how we analyze knowledge claims, and so on. And these teachers were reporting their successes, what went well, what did not all over the world. And there was a teacher whom I had met before who had a degree in philosophy and was teaching this course at a secondary school in the Gulf. I will not name it. He came to me, he said, I felt so, I felt like a hypocrite, he said. I am not teaching this course the way any of these people seem to be doing it so well. I have this Arabic teacher breathing at my neck. They control what I teach. It's reported to them what I say. How I can teach a course which emphasizes critical thinking. Now, why do I mention this? I think it's really very important, not only at the level of secondary education. This is a pioneering type of program, especially at universities. I don't expect you to have a solution to this. I don't have one, certainly. But to me, if you think of problems, what stands in the way of higher education fulfilling any of the serious purposes it is supposed to fulfill, it has to do with academic freedom. And we don't have in the Arab world on the whole. We may want to exaggerate this at AUB. I don't want to go into that. But from your research about higher education in the Arab region in general, is this problem getting resolved, alleviated, at what level, or is this dogmatic attitude controlling free thought is still deeply entrenched and refuses to go? Thank you.
Yeah, so So Livia's question first about language of instruction and access. I think this is a real challenge for this region, and I mean the challenges are different from country to country. I mean, here in Lebanon, you know, the 3 languages. You have the predominantly French track education or English track, and even within that, it's not all English. There'll be some subjects that may be taught in Arabic, depending on whether it's state school or private school. And then you have, obviously, you can't just think about it at the level of higher education. You have to think of it in terms of what's happening in primary and secondary. And if we're thinking about those of lower socioeconomic backgrounds, they're going to have less home support. Parents able to help them with their homework if it's an English school, French school, and they're Arab speakers. So it's hugely complicated. I mean, I think, you know, accommodations can perhaps be done when it gets to, I mean, so I think the first point is one has to kind of think of it in holistic terms. It's not just an issue of higher education, it's the whole system. One needs to think that this is, it's a holistic challenge. But I mean, things can be done. You know, AUB, for example, it has a year of preparatory English for some courses, and so students who get scholarships will also get funding for that preparatory year. I'm not sure. I mean, I did meet with the head of that preparatory section. I don't think it's my sense is it's not a hugely developed part of what AUB offers. But I mean, it's those sort of things, I suppose, that can just perhaps be built on and developed, that language isn't an unduly extra burden, that it can be facilitated to some extent within the university system, despite obviously this being a societal, bigger structural issue. Professor Bashir, yes, thinking about higher education versus university, they're not synonymous terms. So I mean, obviously that brings to mind, if one thinks, for example, of Germany. Germany has a very well developed and credible and highly respected vocational sector, as a parallel track alongside the academic, more kind of university frame. And so when one talks of widening access into higher education, it's not about, it's not, I suppose, this is not an argument against diversification of routes in higher education. Of course, there's fitness for purpose, and that's fine to have diversification of routes. I think the issue is if one's thinking of the university and access to the university, and the university is representing often something that has, gives one elite capital. It's not about letting everyone in, but it's thinking about it in demographic terms. So it's widening, not increasing. So it's thinking, who are the demographic? If it's mostly all, people from middle and upper class, we put a question mark there. It's not about, saying we don't care about quality, but it's thinking about who are those that are allowed in. So it's widening, not increasing, that I think is the distinction to make. And then thirdly, the issue of academic freedom. I completely agree with you. And I think, we're relatively lucky here in Lebanon, but I think, in some parts of the region, especially those working on issues in social sciences and humanities, in the Gulf, I think it's extremely difficult, and that's why I put up that quote about varying levels and types of academic oppression. I think it is a real issue. And so, I think links to Professor Haider's comment about social sciences and humanities. I think these things are also related in terms of the quality.
Any improvement in this area?
Any improvement? I don't know. Maybe Professor Hanafi can tell us.
With the introduction of all these imported university from liberal institutions from US and Europe.
Yeah.
Is this confined to technology?
Is
it being contagious? Does the presence of this create an atmosphere where the student going there cannot help but
personally,
think?
I don't think it comes from pumping in branch universities into conservative contexts. I don't think that's the way to go in terms of academic.
So we'll have
a final round of questions. Yes, Haidar, please, let's wait for the microphone.
Mr. Lee, you talk about access and the equity, the justice of access, that the unprivileged, low socioeconomic classes have less access. And I want to say that the problem, people at AUB, people who pay money at AUB have access. But still AUB suffers from that failure. Because those who have access, the elite, the problem is not only that the low socioeconomic classes are not having access, but that the elite choice is unhelpful. The elite in England, yes, they go and do PPE because they ensure that they come also from certain social classes and they can. Here, the elite choice is actually unhelpful, both at the intrinsic level and the instrumental level of higher education. So the problem here is that it's a deeper problem that cuts across socioeconomic classes. They all want to become engineers and doctors and economists. That's the only social sciences they can think of. So in that sense, this is something that cuts across socioeconomic classes, which is not true in places like England, the US, where this is a clear difference. So the kind of link to work is prominent as a concern even for those who are wealthy and this certain type of, and that's actually something that needs to be addressed, not only the social equity.
Can I just ask you why you think that is?
I mean, there are several reasons, of course, but I think it has to do with the schooling. Partly, schooling has this tendency to encourage sciences, those who don't do well in science, and those who go to literature, and those who have failed in the math and sciences. So it's a sign of failure rather than a choice, genuine choice. And maybe in conditions with social uncertainty, people fear taking risks. When you have a social system and political system that's stable, people can take certain risks. So it's, I mean, this needs to be a question. I don't know the causes. I'm sure that the phenomena is there, and it's different from what you see in other places. And this is apart from the access to education.
Another comment or question? So this will, yeah, sorry, please.
Thank you first. Second, in one of your last slides, there is, I think, a recommendation towards increasing public funding for private universities. I'm just curious as to what is the rationale or the justification behind that. And so the second part of my question is, in Lebanon, for example, we now have close to 40 private universities, and this is definitely very negatively affecting the quality. And so how would you relate that, for example, with...
Yeah, the idea of the article there where it's talking about public funding to private universities was in relation to access. So that it's supporting kind of a statewide level of political commitment to the notion of access. That private universities are not just, operating completely separately. So it was that was the rationale.
Okay, do you have any concluding points? There's more. Oh, sorry.
Just one small comment. Thank you. Just one more thing regarding access. I really missed a reference to the fees and the trend, the historical trend in fees, and how this impacts the access, especially of those socially more vulnerable. Also, another issue is the pattern of the pupil-teacher ratios and how massification, how it translates into the actual crowdedness of universities.
probably skirted over it. Yeah, you're right. I didn't talk an awful lot about fees, but clearly, obviously, the cost of higher education is really one of the most significant barriers, and when it comes in terms of access. And so hence that's kind of the logic around, financial aid, financial scholarships. It's not just about the fees at that point, it's also thinking in terms of, so for example in Egypt, where there might be, or in other examples where, fee levels are adjusted or waived or there's financial aid, it's still an issue because it represents a loss in income, or it's the fear of personal debt. Or it's also that, as someone was mentioning, access into, getting the Thanawiya Amma in Egypt is based on lots of rote memorization. And so parents put a lot of money into private tutoring so that their children can get the right marks on these exams to get into higher education. So it's not just about the tuition fees, but it's obviously, one has to think about access in terms of economics, absolutely.
Any last question?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dina, for this very interesting lecture and for the exchange of questions and answers. Please follow us on our Facebook. Alex will love this. Follow us on our Facebook page and our Twitter account for any coming events. We have a busy spring coming. Our next event is on Friday with the human rights advocate Surani coming from Gaza. He will be speaking here at noon time, so if you're interested in this subject, a great figure in human rights in Palestine will be here. And next week we're having President Michel Sleiman also speaking at the Hustler Center, in the auditorium there, about his experience after leaving the presidency. Thank you very much, and hope to see you soon.